Welcome, everyone. Wonderful to see everyone here. We have a really wonderful lineup of people together speaking about anticipation and imagination, which is a theme for Earth System Governance that once upon a time was called Anticipatory Governance, but this sort of covers more accurately what people are actually doing, it seems like. And Manjana and I are hosting this wonderful session. I'm going to hand over to Manjana in a moment for an introduction. But yeah, just really glad to be here. Really nice opportunity to connect. And I think this is a really exciting, high energy topic for Earth System Governance that we want to keep feeding. So over to you, Manjana, I think.
Thank you, Joost, and hi and welcome everybody. So we wanted to use this, one of our two sessions at the forum this year, to kind of assess where the field is at. Imagination and anticipation was introduced as a new research lens into the framework of the Earth System Governance Project 5 years ago. And this is a really nice moment to take stock a little bit. And we had hoped to involve as many of you as possible in that, by inviting you to submit what you consider to be one of the key contributions to this field of anticipation of imagination and Earth System Governance with a bit of a justification. We received a number of nominations, and you will hear about those from 6 or maybe 7 fabulous speakers in a moment. But before we go there, I wanted to try and give maybe a very rough high-level assessment of, or a little bit of a summary of how the field might have evolved since 2018, at least based on our conferences and the Earth System Governance Project. So I have a small presentation. It will not take very long, but let me see if I can call that out. So, right. So I think from the 10 must-knows, we might be to about 5 today. We'll see what we get. So anticipation and imagination, as I said, is a new research lens within the framework. We have 5 research lenses, and it's been introduced in the Science and Implementation Plan in 2018. And it clearly, the work within our community has expanded, at least by the very simple count of how many papers have been presented within the stream at each of our conferences since then. So we had, of course, also COVID and other instances where we didn't have a full conference, and there might be a bit of a blip in the middle. But we've seen a clear expansion of just the number of papers on imagination and anticipation. That in itself, I think, is a good indicator that we've been triggering some good work. But overall, the volume within this research lens is still smaller compared to the more established research lenses, the other ones within the ESG project. Here, I just took all the abstracts of the papers that you have been presenting over the last 5 years and threw them into a word cloud maker to tell you like what are the key themes maybe, and it's very clear that climate change stands out as the key or central topic here. And then a little smaller things like policy and global and future. And I was glad to see that imagination and anticipation, which you see a bit to the right and a bit to the left, have roughly the same weight, at least in terms of how frequently they're mentioned, because that's also an interesting question a bit in terms of whether the work has been focusing more on the idea of anticipatory governance and what anticipation actually is, or anticipatory capacities and processes versus this, what I think is a little more a recent term of imagination. It's of course related, right? These things are interdependent in some sense, but still these are 2 subdomains within our task force and our research lens. Some key trends, I think we've seen a clear expansion on, or we could say rise, focus on anticipatory governance within the overall governance conversation. So the recognition that with complexities within the Earth system or in our environmental systems we're dealing with, and the need to understand futures and look further into the future, there is a need for more anticipatory modes of governance. So that is there, and that work is expanding. And also then, I think we've seen a very strong anchoring of the notion of imagination and futures thinking as a needed capacity within governance. And that I think is fairly new and a bit of a radical departure from kind of the rational choice or linear modes of policymaking and planning that most folks are dominant today or that we're very familiar with. So that is positive. We've also have a bit of a growing conversation about what these imaginative or anticipatory modes of governance mean in a multi-level governance setting, where I think most of the work, the research that has been conducted and empirical work happens actually at the community and local level. But we've also had a couple of really interesting contributions that address global level knowledge production. Laura is here as one of the representatives who's been written a bit about this. The IPBES, for example, how imagination and anticipation are needed also in the global governance institutions and how that kind of knowledge is being produced and should be produced. And we've seen, I think, a very important expansion of discussions about the need for justice and equity conversations within the space of anticipatory governance. Question about who is at the table, who imagines, what are the processes, who sets those agendas, with what implications for vulnerable or marginalized communities and so forth. So these are some trends. We've also seen maybe what you might want to call theoretical advances or some conceptual shifts that they're already somewhat hinted at with these four trends that I just outlined. So a bit from predictive to more participatory and reflexive anticipation. So going away from maybe quantitative modeling, data-based approaches to more qualitative and let's say imaginative and diverse processes that allow for more participation. Then, as I said earlier, imagination as a governance tool itself is, I think, a pretty novel and growing idea. This has been linked in interesting ways to the scholarship on transformation, because transformations, of course, require, in a sense, that we are visioning or imagining where we want to transform to. So there's a component of pathway thinking included there. Anticipation as an ethical and justice-oriented practice, I just mentioned that. And there's also some conceptual shifts that have been, I think, gone on longer since the introduction probably of the planetary boundaries concept and before even of systemic and planetary thinking, where we're clearly recognizing we need kind of an Earth systems perspective that to address our environmental challenges. That's been a key driver for the Earth System Governance Project, of course, from the very beginning. Then growing focus on futures literacy and collective imagination. So away from imagination as this individual creative mental activity to how does this actually work in communities and across scales, maybe even at the global scale. Then a growing focus on critical and radical futures, and temporality is a focus on time, temporality, and questions around temporality in governance have been expanding and very productive for our community. Then all of you are doing interesting stuff using different methods. Here's just a little overview over the key methods that I've detected. Of course, this is, says nothing about which ones are the most dominant or used the most or the best, but here at least some of the ones that I think I've seen across the last 5 years. Of course, within the foresight community, scenario planning, scenario development, and analysis is important, and that is linked to participatory foresight and co-production methods. Most of these scenario or backcasting processes are, of course, participatory ways of engaging communities in future thinking. Then there are narrative methods linked to futures literacy, narrative ways of making meaning out of futures, deliberative and reflexive governance approaches, also agent-based modeling, complex systems thinking, somewhat more linked to the natural science community, and then ethnographic and case study methods. And then really briefly, there might be, I don't know if there are really gaps, but certainly some spaces where there are really big, important questions on the horizon where more work is needed, or where I would say there are kind of next steps where, I'm hoping that folks would be interested in doing more work in the future. So in some of these are not just to understand how we might be doing anticipatory governance, but with what effects. So what are kind of the long-term impacts of anticipatory governance? Because we really have very little longitudinal investigations of the impacts and effects of causal pathways with which these processes impact governance outcomes. And the role of narratives and imaginaries on governance itself, not just these having narrative processes of meaning making, but whether they actually do have an impact and how policies end up looking and what kinds of effects they have. Equity and justice, so critical need for research focused on how governance practices can incorporate principles of equity and justice, in particular concerning marginalized and vulnerable populations. And then again, empirical studies on governance outcomes, right? So not just how the processes unfold, but also how a particular governance process and its anticipatory components are linked to specific sets of impacts and outcomes. So that's a bit for me, and that's also an invitation to reflect on maybe I've been kind of course, with this very superficial cut on what we've seen within the community's publications and abstracts presented, whether I've been missing something big, maybe your own assessment of where the field is at or where it should be going. This is what the session is going to be all about. So now we're going to transition from me to our wonderful, courageous speakers who have nominated key contributions to the scholarship on anticipation and imagination. As far as I can see right now, we have 6 speakers in the chat. We had invited, I believe, 8, but I think 6 will be fabulous to hear from. Each of them will get about 3 to 5 minutes. I'll give a little signal when we're approaching the 5-minute mark. And I think we are starting with Laura Pereira from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Laura.
Sure, no pressure. Going first. What was it I said I was going to do again? Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Sorry, I'm currently at the International Marine Conservation Conference in Cape Town at the moment. So there's nothing like being at 2 conferences at the same time. But I did just throw together 4 slides on this computational text analysis and narrative. So let me try and find where that is right now. Da-da-da. And I will just quickly go through this. Come on. Sorry. Try again. There we go. Okay, you guys can all see this, yeah? Cool, thumbs up, awesome. So really quickly, the sort of method that I thought was really exciting was this combination of computational text analysis and then sort of narrative. And it was originally sort of spearheaded by Pat Keyes together with the student in 2022. But then also I had a master student, Hannah, who worked on it for her thesis. And in essence, these are the 2 key papers, at least that I know of, that have employed this method. So one was on visioning Arctic futures, and the other one was on imagining sustainable futures for the high seas. And sort of just really, really quickly, I mean, what does the, sorry, I lost my screen. What does this entail? Is in essence a 6-step process. So I hope you guys can actually see this. If I zoom in essence, what you do is you do a systematic review of the type of literature in the area that you want to focus on. So in this instance, Hannah did it on the high seas, looking at everything from sort of conservation to fisheries, deep sea mining, etc. You then do computational text analysis where you cluster these into particular topics. So it's a really, really quantitative based sort of way of understanding what the literature, what text is actually sort of saying out there using some machine learning tools. And sort of it shows sort of what are the most similar, what are the least similar topics. You can then cluster these into sort of really interesting, sort of unique themes. She then went in to do a cross-impact matrix to question like the consequences of these different thematic areas on each other. And this is where it starts to get a little bit more narrative. And she adapted, and so did Patrick actually adapted the Seeds of Good Anthropocene's Manoa method approach. So sort of starting with these themes and then doing kind of a almost future wheel, building up the consequences of these. Then went into sort of really radically visioning using the three horizons approach of just thinking through, okay, if we were to take some of these kinds of themes that are emerging from the literature to the extreme, what would they look like? Really drawing on sort of this iceberg model, which was making sure that it wasn't just kind of the hardcore science that was being analyzed, but that some social, cultural, etc. sort of elements were also being explored. So that was that. And she landed up with 4 really, really cool stories at the end of the day using some science fiction prototyping. So the first was in the Ocean Uprising. Second one was called Curry City. Then there was Deep Connections and Myopia. And these were all sort of also illustrated by an artist, as you can see here. So that's just like a whirlwind of the method, the approach that that she used, and happy to talk through more of it, though I am not the expert, but I still think it is a pretty cool way of going about visioning. Hope that was okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. That was the right speed and a very nice illustration of an amazing method, right? And I think methods are really cool, very important core component of this specific field, maybe more important than in some of the other research fields. So I'm really glad we opened with a really interesting methodological contribution that was nominated by Laura. Thank you very much. Next on my list is Liebrecht Fick from Stellenbosch University, talking about indigenous imagination and post-apocalyptic futures. The floor is yours, Liebrecht.
Hello, yes, I just need to figure out the screen sharing, which is always the online presentation challenge. Sorry about that. Aha. Okay, so just to check quickly, can you see the presentation?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So the insight that I nominated is around indigenous imagination and post-apocalyptic futures. It is based on research that was led by Stephen Corr from the Australian National University, and it's this paper that was published in 2023, and it's really just about including alternative perspectives in imagination work. And this is really based on the idea that, or the reality that for a lot of people, the past is apocalyptic. It's obviously traumatic because of colonialism, genocide, displacement, all these things. And the future actually is, because of that past, the future is extremely hopeful, and it's yeah, obviously it could potentially be very positive, where obviously if you look at sort of the dominant sort of Western or European maybe viewpoint where the future is apocalyptic, it's obviously climate collapse, it's sort of the collapse of a way of life for lots of people. So without these alternative perspectives, the imagination about possible futures is really limited. While we do have these sort of emerging things like transdisciplinarity, co-production, collective imagination, and just diversifying contributions about imagination based on different ways of knowing and doing, obviously that's sort of why you would then open it up and not just stick to sort of mainstream or dominant perspectives in imagination. Yeah, so it's really just about like generating new ideas, new futures based on sort of these alternative perspectives that are also included. And it's just going not just maybe a checkbox exercise that's based on like just including as diverse knowledge types as possible, but actually incorporating different perspectives and different voices and trying to overcome cultural barriers. And then just really to expand the awareness of what the current situation is across the globe for all cultures, and not just obviously like dominant narratives that are maybe very scientific or very Western, very European, very mainstream. And then some interesting things that are just happening. I know last week, I think, there was a whole 3-day conference at Harvard University about ancestral futures. So ancestral futures seems to be something that's quite interesting that's coming up. And obviously the ideas around ancestral futures and ancestral land, like about stewardship and land, and obviously indigenous peoples and their very intertwined relationship with land. Obviously things like Afrofuturism, African science fiction, speculative fiction, obviously the idea of like radical, post-apocalyptic and hopeful futures, and then obviously other ways of stimulating imagination, such as arts-based research practices. So yeah, those are all sort of the things that I feel like are sort of touched upon when you sort of try to think of, yeah, how do we start incorporating indigenous imagination, post-apocalyptic futures into these processes of imagining and futuring. So yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So this is great and tackles straight one of the key issues I think we've come. Hang on one second. Evening conferences and toddlers. So I thought this tackled straight one of the key challenges in our field. And I think this is the fact that we've observed that many of our anticipatory or futuring methods end up helping to reproduce dominant narratives, or that we have a really hard time moving away from those dominant narratives. So really exploring how radically different or more diverse futures can be imagined, rooted also in indigenous or ancestral histories. That was great. So thank you very much for that, Liebrecht. And then we're moving on to Joost Verwoerd, somebody you all know at Utrecht University, and he's going to talk about imagination infrastructures. Joost, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marianne. Yeah, I want to talk about imagination infrastructures, which is a concept that has emerged from practice, specifically from the work of Cassie Robinson and her colleagues. There's a long history of work around sort of infrastructural work around the imagination in the context of futures and related fields, but this sort of practical work that's really focused on building new imagination infrastructures in practice done by Cassie and her colleagues describes imagination infrastructures as configurations of resources from which collective radical forms of future visions may emerge. So, and it's interesting to look at futures from this sort of infrastructural perspective. And so Cassie and colleagues talk about resources, archives, spaces, and communities that are characterized by the type of imagining they nourish: interdisciplinary, experimental, pluralizing, and counter-hegemonic. What this isn't is just some art material, taking some art materials into a community space and sitting together at the question. It's more infrastructural than that. But one thing that I'm interested in with this is that and I'm working on this on a paper together with my colleague Roy Bendor, is that a lot of this work on imagination infrastructures is creative. So it's focused on supporting the development of new infrastructures, a carving of spaces and places and relationships, and sort of physical and metaphysical, tangible and intangible structures for radical futures. What Roy and I are interested in, though, is that it's also possible to look at imagination infrastructures as a conceptual lens, to see the latent imaginative possibilities hidden in existing infrastructures, because of course society is made up of imagination infrastructures, right? There are physical, financial, and cultural and so on infrastructures everywhere that prop up existing dominant imaginations and imaginaries. So we are interested in that. And I'm interested in looking at that in the space of games, because there's a lot of sort of like a lot of this sort of culture war stuff going on around imagination infrastructures. For instance, right now we are, I guess, a little bit in the latter end of Gamergate 2, which is a sort of like right-wing reactionary reaction to an extreme right, sometimes reaction to the sort of progressive forces that are trying to reshape video games. Video games are an interesting set of imagination infrastructures to look at, because video games are 6 times bigger than film, 6 times bigger than music, and it's a massive industry with a lot of politics about who gets to own what, you know, things like game engines, distribution platforms, social media around games, funding, and design education play a huge role in what is shaped in terms of what is possible to be imagined in and around video games. And we are interested in both the ways that these spaces are closed off or are reproducing existing imaginaries, and the ways in which they're opened up and giving space to radical alternatives. And especially, and that's what we're working on right now, the sort of power struggles, the attempts to co-opt from different political perspectives these imagination infrastructures and mobilize them and use them. And that's the mobilization is really based on work that Manana has done around cultural mobilization of these spaces and these infrastructures for certain political goals. So yeah, that's exciting work. Just a little bit of a snippet of that, and yeah, I would say if you're interested in talking more about imagination infrastructures, let me know. There might be a special issue coming in futures that offers space for people to work on this. So that's just a heads up about that.
Great. Even a little announcement right at the end there for opportunities to come ahead. What I like about this contribution is that you currently can't find this really in the academic literature, at least not yet, until Joost and his colleague have published their upcoming piece. But it is such an interesting idea. See, there was your timer, Joost, perfectly in time. It's such an interesting idea that moves from processes of anticipation and imagination to structural and spatial and interactive dimensions and variables that really need attention, that are tied to where do things happen, in what kinds of interaction patterns, in which places, with what resources. So there's a materiality to this and a link to power and resources that is, I think, really interesting. This is a fascinating new concept to work with. Very cool. All right, next we have Nisha Dutt, who's going to talk about a toolbox of participatory foresight methods. Nisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll just start by giving a little background as to how I came into this session. The thing is that I'm based in India, and I did my PhD in the field of urban ecology. And I got introduced into the Anticipatory Governance Slack team through Professor Joost. So my journey actually started from there. So by no means am I an expert in any of this, but I'm glad that I can speak about the paper that I have nominated. And so I'll start with that. So the paper that I have nominated is titled Towards a Climate Resilient Future Together, a toolbox with participatory foresight methods, tools, and examples from climate and food governance. So I'll quickly summarize the publication and talk about why I think it's important. So as stated in the title itself, the publication is a toolkit for participatory foresight methods, particularly for citizens to build a climate resilient future together. So why is this toolkit important? Is because climate change is everywhere and affecting everyone, as we all know. And when we are thinking about the future of the world, we know that there are many uncertainties involved. So while local governments and policymakers want citizens to participate in planning processes, citizens tend to find these planning processes or exercises difficult in terms of the technicality that they involve, and find themselves somewhat distant from the process itself. So in order for both policymakers and citizens to find planning exercises meaningful and engaging, the toolkit provides a practical guide to how to develop such collaborations in order to build sustainable and resilient communities. So with respect to that, the publication focuses on two particular aspects, which are also recognized as challenges. The first one is citizen participation, and the second one is foresight methods. Foresight is described as the act of thinking about the future to guide decisions today. The toolkit thus provides guidance on how to organize participatory exercises and use effective foresight methods. So there are two phases that the paper talks about. The first one is a preparation phase where questions around why does one want citizen participation, who to involve, and which foresight methods to use are being looked at. And the first question is about why does one want citizen participation, and three main goals were thought to be important in this aspect. The first one being policy development, the second one being community building, and the third one being knowledge and capacity building. Now, public participation in policy development is a desirable goal for futuring, and engaging multiple stakeholder perspectives is beneficial for both citizens and policymakers. Similarly, community development and capacity building can be the outcomes from meaningful participatory foresight exercises, which can build knowledge, raise awareness, and generate support from people that matter. And in this case, we are talking about local citizens in different settings, whether they are urban, rural, or peri-urban settings. The next question is to understand how to involve the participants. So why should participants feel motivated to join such foresight exercises? The suggestions are to make the participatory foresight exercises useful to the citizens or the people who are participating, develop trust and build interest in the community itself, and accommodate people's diverse schedules while setting the exercise itself, like looking at the aspects of time, energy, the amount of money and effort that the people would be giving if they were interested in participating in such exercises. And also the challenge of communication is important because to communicate is important in terms of inciting meaningful engagement. So tools for engagement could involve different ways, such as surveys, both online and offline, interviews, focus groups, guided walks, data interpretation and analysis, and so on. And this could also include visual maps and future experiences under alternate local climate scenarios. Next is the question of which foresight methods to use. Now, there are 3 categories that have been proposed, and using a combination of these in the same exercise is also encouraged. The first one being exploratory scenarios, which describe a range of alternative plausible futures that may happen. The next category is visioning, which looks at desirable futures that require a more dedicated action and more concrete steps towards the desired goal. And the third category is pathways, which identifies ways to get to the desirable future that one has envisioned. And this can be through regular backcasting exercises, incremental backcasting, which takes into account sudden disturbances, and a seeds-based pathway, which involves building from already successful local initiatives. So how to use foresight
Nisha,
methods in practice?
you have half a minute left.
Sure. So the action phase talks about how to use these methods in practice. So basically trying to understand the practical aspect of exploring plausible futures, then going on to imagine a desired future, and then within a regular backcasting exercise, starting to vision an output and formulate an action plan, label and order those actions, and discover storylines, and then going on to put the regular backcasting exercise into a timeline to then explore the unexpected scenarios that may play out, and then trying to understand a seeds-based pathways to understand and identify seeds and then explore how those seeds can grow. So why I think it is important for this publication to be considered is because it is a very practical way of understanding how to engage people. And we want citizens and people to come and support and actually participate in the planning that we do for climate change adaptation and mitigation. And also it can be adapted to different places and contexts. So if I want to do apply the same principle in a place like India, in a city where I live, then I can think about doing that by taking this toolkit as a guideline. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisha, for talking about a very important aspect of our anticipatory and imagination work, which is making processes participatory. And that has not just advantages, right? There's also challenges of how to actually engage people in these processes for what benefit, with what purpose. So thank you very much for that. Next in our program, and I think we just posted the order of speakers, so you all know roughly where we're at. Next will be Daniel Parkman at the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, and he will talk to us about past casting. Daniel.
So I can't see you. Could you just confirm that you can hear me and that you can see the slides?
Yep.
Yes to both.
Okay, great. So I am at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, and this builds on the work of several people, but this particular presentation could equally well have been held by my 2 colleagues here on the slide, Elina and Minna. And we started with the question, how can we decrease the distance between what has to be done, like, for example, the Paris Agreement, and what I feel or what we feel is possible to do, like buying low energy light bulbs and sorting my trash. And as we all know, it's now 2020, and we have a huge challenge in front of if we're going to live up to the Paris Agreement. We need to decrease carbon emissions by 50% every decade, 3 times in a row, which means basically 7% reductions per year for the next 30 years. That means that in 30 years from now, we should be down at 12.5% of current emissions. Okay, so we can then ask, what will academia look like? What will academic life look like in 2050 when we, for example, have decreased CO2 emissions from flying by 87.5%? That's a very tough task to imagine. So let's instead just concentrate on the next decade and ask, so what will academia or academic life look like 10 years from now when we have decreased our emissions by 50%? Okay, let's look at this timeline, and in particular, look at where the numbers 2020, 30, 40, 50, and just check out what happens now. 3, 2, 1, bam. Okay, so we're now at 2020, and we actually managed to decrease our carbon emissions by 50% in the past decade. So what does academic life look like today after we now have decreased emissions from flying by 50%? So this is past casting. Here's our workshop that we did. We made it. Academia has lowered CO2 emissions from flying by 50% in a decade. Join us to figure out how we did it. So this is past casting. This is back casting placed in the past, where we ended up in an alternative and more desirable present, which we then explore at the workshop. So what does an alternative low-carbon 2020 academia look like? What do our lives look like? How has this changed academia? And how did we get here? So these are the questions that this reframing, that past casting, invites us to pose. Here's another take on this. Imagine your life in 2030 with 50% of the oil used today, and then the past casting version of this question is, imagine your life today with 50% of the oil we used 10 years ago. This is a series of workshops we've done, actually quite a few of them, both online and in different parts of Sweden, where I want you to look at 2, 3, and 4. So 2 is where the world took a different turn. In 2008 was actually not a financial crisis, it was an underlying oil crisis. And everybody realized we need to decrease our dependence on oil and other fossil fuels, but we just concentrate on oil here. If we jump forward to 3, we imagine what an alternative present would look like together with workshop participants. And then we jump to 4. So how did we get here? What did we actually do to decrease our oil dependence or our oil addiction in the last 13 years in this workshop? Okay, so you're all familiar with future-facing, futuring techniques, forecasting and backcasting. So what we are doing is we are placing them in the past with recasting and past casting, which you can read more about in the paper by Roy Bender. He was also part of Joost's presentation, and my colleague Elina and me. And why then past casting? Okay, failure is not an option. We've already achieved what we are aiming for, and we just need to figure out how we did it. So this is very playful, this is liberating, this is imaginative. We know who we are today. I am basically, or I can be the same. I have the same lived experience, same job, age, family situation, etc., which makes it easier to imagine what compared to what I will be like in 2050. I will probably be dead, by the way. So nobody suggests techno fixes. Like people just don't. Oh, but if this had been the case, we would have electric airplanes today. Nobody suggests that's in our workshops. It's only behavioral change. And the proposed solutions then are exactly what we actually could start doing tomorrow. Here is some more info. I don't know how I can make this available, but the 2017 paper is a recasting exercise. The 2021 paper is past casting. And if you want to work with this, do get in touch with us. We'd like to help you get started. So our email addresses are there. Thank you. All the material, by the way, is also Creative Commons available online. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, for another really interesting methodological contribution or methods contribution, shifting our perspective maybe from alternative futures to alternative presents, right? Just a slight focusing of the perspective of the method might help us imagine differently or more creatively. Very cool. So now next, second to last, is going to be Lucas Rotting at Utrecht University, and he's going to talk about disruptive seeds.
Yes, thanks, Manjana. Disruptive seeds, indeed. I cheated a little bit. I nominated my paper, or the paper I led on disruptive seeds. There are a couple of co-authors in this room as well, Joost and Laura, among others. And I also quickly want to talk about a new paper I'm leading, which is currently in the phase of revisions on applying disruptive seeds. So yeah, disruptive seeds. The approach was developed in response to the need to address the politics of transformations, and in particular, the role of power in transformations. It builds on the Seeds of Good Anthropocene's approach and a need expressed in the seeds community to involve activists and change makers. Disruptive seeds as an approach focuses on those seeds that actively challenge the unsustainable status quo. We developed a set of questions based on scholarship on power and transitions and transformations to guide discussions and imaginations of how power shifts may unfold, including questions around unmaking, destabilization of current regimes, and how discursive tools can be used, for example. And actually, each of these questions could be unpacked and guiding future research in themselves as well, which is interesting, of course. As such, the disruptive seeds approach is a strong example of the value of integrating futures thinking with social and political science research around governance and power dynamics. And as I already quickly said at the beginning, I'm currently also leading a paper that reports on the application of the approach, of the disruptive seeds approach, in the context of the food system in Guatemala, with the central questions, how can it foster, it being the disruptive seeds approach, how can it foster transformative imagination, and how can it put the perspectives and imaginations of marginalized and indigenous communities front and center. And to that end, we developed an analytical framework for analyzing transformative imagination that basically distinguishes between two types of power it may challenge. First of all, institutional, legal, economic, and political power. And secondly, and this is the more interesting one, of course, power in terms of discourse, narrative, and imaginaries. And when you unpack that further, you can ask questions about whether the approach fosters reflexive understanding of dominant imaginaries, if it provokes and transforms the dominant imaginaries, and if it introduces new imaginations, new knowledge, and local views of futures. And yeah, one of the preliminary discussions, we also have some co-authors from indigenous communities in Guatemala. And one of these co-authors contends that imagination is a crucial and integral component of indigenous peoples' resistance against the negative impacts of colonialism and capitalism. And this, of course, also connects to the previous presentation by Liebrecht. So it's cool to see some cross links here as well. Yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to share.
Great, thank you, Lucas. So it's great to see some connections already, but also something we haven't talked much about yet or heard yet, and that is the important role of power. I think that's one of the trends or one of the streams in the literature that I have seen over the last 5 years is the expanded focus on the fact that, of course, anticipatory practices and imagination spaces are also places where where power plays a very important role. These are spaces of politics, right, where futures are debated and contested and made in some sense, where power and influence really matter, and attention to those needs, those aspects of imagination needs to grow. So this was great. And by the way, you did not cheat. Submitting your own work was totally part of the rules. All right, so that takes us to our last flash talk for today by Minori Pereira from the Industrial Technology Institute about a design futures framework for digital social architectures in the making. So Minori, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm not from the industry. Just wanted to correct, I'm not from the industrial technical. I'm an independent researcher, and I have a media and futures project that I'm running on. So just want to clarify that. Shall I share my screen?
Sorry, that was my mistake. Should have fixed that before.
Nothing industrial, so I didn't want anyone to get misled. Okay, hi. So I'll try to keep this very brief. I deleted slides as I saw that it had to be super quick. So I have been getting deeper and deeper into the digital world only for the last 6 years. I kind of stayed offline for a really long time. And I have been looking at my passions coming out of a digital futures master. And sorry, hold on, let me get this up here. So I was very inspired, or at least I found a lot of resonance when I first heard about Benjamin Bratton's work in general, and then his YouTube lectures, but then also The New Normal came out in 2020. So I found that there were different resonances in what I was looking at in terms of media and how it affects so much of our cultural day-to-day lives and sociopolitics. So I've been looking more at an intersectional through a lens on what is this emerging metaverse and how it impacts most of us in the new normals, but largely kind of flitting through intergenerational work done between Gen X artists and others. So the terms I'm using in this, and since a lot of this is coming both from my own creative practice, but also as kind of a research framing that I'm working on, there are terms and analysis that I'm using based on the artist and researcher and designer that I am, like Novo 20s, which is coming up in a paper that I want to put out there about this kind of period we're going through that is overlapping the new normals, the 2010s and 20s, and what feels like another new wave of 20s as such. So yes, that's kind of where Benjamin Bratton, Karen Barad, and then just a lot of mashup of me working through intersectional analysis of the things that I'm looking at. So on the why, Gen X was the first actual digital generation. We didn't really have all the devices, but we kind of made the devices later, and we kind of lived on film and music. So I've been pulling a lot of that, and a lot of the older artists, it's a different ethos, right? Then you kind of create things in a different ethos than it does in so much of the media structures that we work in now, where people become artists for very interesting and different reasons. And I'm looking at this present as the becomings of a future towards a long-term window into the futures that are coming in. So being a little mindful of what we are displaying now as the way we are positioning social, cultural issues emerging out of artists' lives and their creations as what they're being taken as role models, but also as lessons. So, metaversely speaking, I've just been sitting around, watching these last 2 years, these Coldplay's public healings. I mean, honestly, a little bit amazed and shocked at the amount. 2 years, 164 shows, sold out. And I'm not, I'm not worried so much about the politics of this, but I'm worried in terms of the structural politics, as it is that there are the people attending massive shows, multiples of them in a short space of time, and that's just one. And it is the largest. It is the largest tour right now in history. to date, and it'll end next year. And then, you see things like the complete frenzy over the Oasis band reunion, which again has been fed over time. And then a 651K tweet frenzy of before and after, a week before and a week after. And then there's, of course, the very many vagaries and interesting actions of fan armies, which are now building everywhere. That kind of started with BTS. So this might seem very different from the stuff we've talked before, but I've just been observing so much, and actually sometimes a little surprised at the comments of people in my own life who I do not expect to really take positions on, things that happen in popular culture. That's one thing, is that it does affect people, and especially younger people. But also, this is, of course, a very big industry. 1.4 trillion, not all of it was music, but the entire creative services is a 1.4 trillion industry. That was just 2 years ago. And a lot of them matter, both metaphysically really matters. So this is going to take time, so I won't go and I'll skim over it. So
yeah, you have about half a minute left, Manoj.
Yeah, so there's things that I've seen that are coming out of the whole larger kind of cognitive connection to the digital metaverse. There's a lot of negativity in it, like in the sense there's a lot of anxiety, despair, fear, racism, schisms, a lot of them. But there's also other trends that are coming up, and I took that slide out, it was too much, but there's also a lot of other stuff to be hopeful about, because there are lots of emergent spaces that are mixing up culturally, but also as a practice. So in this work, I have been kind of looking at phenomena, like taking a larger event, whether it's a scandal or whether it's just something like having 64 shows in 2 years, and looking at what that means around cross-cutting intersectional issues, drawing back to who they are and where they come from, because again, we don't change so fast as we think, as people, as cultures, as societies. So trying to place these discussions that we have in cancel cultures and extreme views on what's wrong and who's right, when actually it's a creative practice that is really more of a central issue. So just framing educational but interactive play tools around that I want to work with both youth and others with. And that's kind of where this is all coming from, is like pushing towards having these findings as open-ended discussions to talk about the future roles that we have, whether we're modeling as a creative, as a man, a woman, as whatever your sexual identity, like what is it, these cross sections that are so important in culture today, being as somewhat woke as we are. So yeah, that's just me.
Thank you, Manoj, for opening up our conversation to a whole set of phenomenon issues that we have not yet included, and the really interesting focus on digital and cultural components that matter a lot for our practices, and maybe emerging new patterns of imagination and anticipation that are important for governance. So thank you all for your short and super interesting presentations. What I would like to do next is open this up for a bigger conversation with everybody in the room about what you've heard, what you've had a whole range of presentations on different topics, from the methods, from the sources of the futures, or the substance of the futures that we imagine, to the politics and the infrastructures and maybe the technologies that matter for this. So what are you missing still in this kind of review or assessment of key contributions to our scholarship over the last 5 years? Can you think of others? Where do you see the value in some of these, or the trends of where the scholarship is going? Maybe you have another idea that you want to present really briefly. So tell us a bit about what you thought, what came up when you listened to these contributions, and maybe think about the idea, 1 minute. Sorry. And then I was wondering if you are interested, because we had intended this as a larger community effort to get more nominations in terms of what are key contributions, and then maybe move even to a bit of a voting process to see if we find patterns of what the community thinks are more important or key contributions. If there's interest in that, we could proceed with some of that. But at least I would love to collect a few more submissions of what you think are some of the most important advances in the field. And we could do that. We could take a little time for that in the chat. So let's open it up and see what folks think. And you can do that by raising your hand virtually, I believe. I think all attendees have that ability also. I hope Blake can confirm that folks can speak even if they're not speakers.
Yes, feel free to raise your virtual hand and then we can take the questions.
All right, we have silenced everybody with these very interesting ideas.
I think Michelle asked if they could enable the chat box for the participants. I don't know if that's an option.
We cannot, it's just the settings that do not let us do that, but we have the Q&A if you would rather just type it as opposed to sharing your.
Yeah, you can do that if you want to type a question. And maybe in the meantime, if you still want to think about a response to what you heard or another thought you had, we can also post the link to the form where people could post their own submissions. So we could take a few moments if you can think of another key contribution that, for example, you are working with and whatever you are working on right now that has been important in informing either your own methodological approach or your own theoretical thinking, that you think might be a cornerstone for the scholarship as we move forward, that you could do that. So we can throw in that link into the chat and folks can use that to add their own nominations that we can maybe use in an assessment paper of the field over the last 5 years. But I see Joost hand. Joost.
Yeah, just while we're waiting for people to come with contributions, there's really fascinating work in the world of practice around collective imagination, and you've mentioned this a bit already, Manjana, in your overview, right? But there's sort of work on embodied imagination and embodied creativity that I see a lot of really fantastic work around that in the world of practice, and it would be interesting to keep an eye. And then some of that exists in research articles as well, but I don't think it's really the same people. And so it's an interesting opportunity to connect some of the cutting edge work in practice to some research efforts.
Thank you, Joost. It also raises, interesting questions about our community's ability to engage in practice and practitioners, right? So to what extent we are a research community or a transdisciplinary community, and how we manage or how successful we are in actually reaching out and engaging or communicating about our findings and our methods with the practitioners who might need these, especially in the space of governance. And I know that Joost often thinks about creative communities in the gaming world. And I often think about actors like climate change negotiators or policymakers in international institutions, right? So how do we get in touch, or do we at all succeed in reaching out to those potential users of the practices that we investigate and believe are so important for Earth system governance?
I see a question. And do you want to speak? It's an anonymous question. Do you want to speak up maybe? Maybe not. I can read it out. So an anonymous attendee says, how can anticipation and imagination scholarship incorporate diverse and intersectoral perspectives to improve environmental justice frameworks? And then another question by Michelle Lee, which is, was curious from the speaker's perspectives of whether we have an interesting challenge in that a lot of the justifications for why we need to imagine alternative futures rest in data that is global, like the IPCC scenarios, but a lot of the practice and methods we have often still work practically better at fairly local or bounded scales. Are we mashing up different narratives and imagined futures? I think there's a lot of people who have something to say about that probably. Michelle, do you want to speak up and clarify that a little bit more, or are you comfortable with that being like?
Yep. Okay.
Yes.
But I think especially Michelle Lee's questions points to a really important matter of scale. And I pointed to that a little bit in the initial presentation too, that there is somewhat of a mismatch possibly between the scales at which the majority of our practices seems to work well, and that tends to be local and community scales, and the scales at which some of the major problems that we're trying to face and address with them are playing out. And there are always multiple scales involved, of course. The local is very important, and important problem dimensions happen there. But there are also larger scales at which we really struggle to apply collective, meaningful, anticipatory processes or imagination processes. Maybe Laura can speak a little bit to that with her IP best work, or maybe other examples, or somebody else in the conversation can tell us a bit about whether they've experienced that, or whether we have tools to tackle that problem, or what might work at a global scale or at a continental scale. Or I think a lot about Earth system tipping processes. They happen at interesting scales that sometimes don't even coincide with the continent or with a international institution in that sense. So how do we start having collective, meaningful, participatory processes that engage actors at that scale to even come to shared understandings of what kinds of futures are threatened with these processes, what kinds of futures are possible, and what kinds of futures might be desirable?
Yeah, I mean, this cross-scale question goes to the heart of all of the challenges we have, right? Particularly these global environmental assessment processes. I think what's interesting, and it's something that you alluded to, Manjana, is that even though ultimately, yeah, the rationale operates at the planetary level, we have the interventions, the governance, the mechanisms of the how to change tend to happen at very different levels, mainly at the local. A lot of the impacts also manifest locally, right? Climate, we got so locked into, I think, a climate space where we were operating at this kind of climate, no matter where the emissions are coming from, the impact is going to be global. But I think as soon as we started to play around a bit more with sort of looking at biodiversity or other aspects, you started to realize that it's a whole lot messier, that you need a lot more contextual nuance. I think even talking to the other question on sort of intersectional perspectives, like different knowledge systems, different ways of understanding what the challenges or the solutions might be in different parts of the world is really, really critical. And I think we're starting to get there, but we need to do a better job of bridging that more bottom-up process and understanding that it's a mishmash of all of these kind of at the global level, and how we can actually do that still in a way that's consistent and compelling and can do the work that we need from these scenarios and visions for decision makers at different levels. But yeah, I don't think we solved the problem, but I think we know that it's there.
So I'm hoping that both Liebrecht and Lucas will come in on this, because I think they're interesting questions in terms of how, your arguments about indigenous engagement in alternative futures, and then the process that Lucas, the disruptive seeds approach that you outlined, how that might scale, or what the implications of those are for multi-scale approaches. But Joost and Daniel have their hands up, so I'll go for Joost first and then Daniel.
Sounds good. I'll keep it short. So just a little perspective from the national level. So Laura and Lucas and myself have worked for a number of years at the sort of big international scenarios project, where as soon as we were really pushed to have outcomes and impacts by the funders, we moved towards the national level, because there was these scenarios were developed sort of at the level of the global region, but there wasn't enough sort of actual sort of power there to grip and to integrate the scenario work with. And at the national level, of course, there's a lot of executive power typically in different countries. And so we were really sort of almost like opportunistically going for engagement at that level, because we could very clearly impact and show that we would have impact with the scenarios work. But then of course there's still a question, okay, so then you may impact sort of investment priorities or sort of certain policy framings and so on. And then there's still a question of, okay, so how does that actually affect people on the ground though, right? So that's an interesting question as well. How do you use futures work where the power is, and then you may have success with that, but then what does that mean for others who are not at that side of power?
Okay, I would like to say something about scale. The carbon law states that we should decrease carbon emissions by 50% every 10 years. So it is 2024 now, not 2020 as I pretended, but that means that we should decrease global emissions by 50% between now and 34. If you belong to the 10 or 20% who emits the most, either as an individual or a country or whatever level you want to analyze, you probably should decrease a lot faster. But 50% is a hard enough task to imagine. We have looked at flying at our university. We have access to all employees, all flights. And we have also analyzed the inequality of emissions within the university. And there's a measure, you can measure the Gini coefficient, is a measure of inequality of resource use. And the Gini coefficient, the inequality of carbon emissions from flying within our university is actually higher than the economic inequality globally. So there's some people fly a lot at our university, and many fly little and some not at all. So actually our university becomes a microcosm of how should we solve this problem of decreasing carbon emissions. And when you actually put poker chips for a department on physical post-it notes, which we've done, it becomes extremely clear that if you don't fly or if you made one trip, it's very hard to decrease it by 50%. But some people have, they have all the poker chips. It's very clear who needs to decrease. So that's just a comment about scale from our own experiences.
Thank you, Daniel. Manori and then Lucas.
Lucas, if you're still on the same topic of IPCC and scale, you can go ahead. You can go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I wanted to react to that whole scaling part as well. So as Joost already mentioned, I was also involved in that project where we mainly looked at national scale policy processes. But obviously in the current project I'm involved in, focusing on this disruptive seeds approach, it's much more from the bottom up. It's So we focus on that level, and actually we really think with stakeholders, indigenous peoples for the most part, of how to get it to the regime level at some point, right? So it's really about how can we scale this, and we really guide these discussions using the Three Horizons framework that most of you are familiar with, I guess. Laura quickly used it in her presentation as well, which is really about, okay, how can niches or seeds scale and become part of a new regime in the future, right? And that's a question of power shifts, right? So it's really about that's where the heart of the disruptive seeds approach comes in. It's really about thinking how these power shifts can unfold, and also thinking about strategies to instigate these power shifts, right? So also think about what conflicts need to arise. How do we need to pressure the regime, right? All kinds of strategies and activities you can think about, both short and longer term. But of course, working for an international development organization like the CGIAR, we also need to be concerned about outcomes in the shorter run. So we also focus on the scale of these local organizations we work with, these seats, and interpret governance in a broader sense, like most of the people do in this ESG space, of course. Not only government and national policies, but also strategies of indigenous community organizations, of organic farmers organizations. So that way, we already begin actually with, starting to instigate something of transformative change at the local level. And we also aim to form coalitions that at some point might coalesce and gain momentum. Maybe I'm talking way too long, so I leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Lucas. And then Manori.
Yes, hi. I wanted to address the question from the anonymous participant on the environmental justice frameworks and intersectionality. So while the term intersectionality is somewhat near to most of the discussions or even anticipatory governance, 20 years ago when I started international development, ecofeminists and many other development workers from the global south were already centralizing the importance of including a lot of the different communities, caste, class, women, and so multiple indigenous tribes around the world were already part of. So Vandana Shiva, for one, has been one of the longest standing eco-feminist fighters for environmental justice. And she has been very clear what it means for tribal rights and women's rights. And additionally, including what just mentioned earlier, Cassie Robinson's work, and if you follow the threads as well as the collective collective futures frameworks, you see tons of work already. There's so much work around ways to integrate, and it is being integrated. So if you are curious, anonymous user, you can take a look at the Collective Imagination Practices Toolkit, which leads you into many other streams, as well as the work of Cassie Robinson and Oliver Oldham. All of them lead you to various other portals where there are practitioners using and applying extremely robust frameworks that include marginalized communities and genders. So yeah, it is being used, and it's a very big answer if I go any deeper. So yeah, but you can look into that if you're interested.
Thank you, Manori, for guiding us towards that resource, which you also now posted in the chat. I hope I can repost for everyone. That is great. Do we have any other questions or comments? I actually have a question. I don't know how helpful it is, but a question for everyone, and that is, do you see yourself as an anticipation scholar or an imagination scholar, or do you not make that distinction? So do we really have a perceived unified field of those two domains, or do you associate your own work with one specific subdomain within this? So we have these two terms, and at least my historical sense of our field is that we added the imagination a little later, conceptually, but I don't know if that makes a difference to what you do or how you do or how you define yourself. Does anybody want to come out as one or the other, or is that too personal a question to ask?
I got very excited when I started looking at imagination some years ago, and I was very, very relieved when I heard about imagination infrastructures, and that it was headed in the direction, because I think coming as a creative practitioner who came into futures work, I think it's just helped expand this complex cluster, what it means for my imagination to run free and then integrate anticipatory practices and foresight methods, just because you're looking at culture and politics and governance even in an informal sense, even if I'm not working with the government, right? I'm looking at popular culture, which is extremely powerful. So yeah, I feel more comfortable and much happier that I can frame my work within imagination studies right now.
Okay, here's a vote for imagination. Also, the audience is very welcome to chime in either through the Q&A or raising your hand. Does anybody else want to tell us where they fall? Because I'm trying to work out what the relationship between those things actually is, right? Do we have to separate them? How are they linked? As I said earlier, I think there's of course a strong imagination component in most of our anticipatory governance practices. And the ability to imagine individually and collectively is clearly a capacity that is needed within anticipatory governance, if you will, maybe one of many. But I do want to understand a bit how the field itself sees itself, whether it's and where it's growing more or where the scholarly interests are moving. Lucas? Oh, you're still muted, Lucas.
Yeah, so I think a couple years ago, I would consider myself more of an anticipation scholar. And like you said, that whole focus on imagination only started to gain traction in the last couple of years, at least from my perspective. And actually, I feel much more comfortable by calling myself an imagination scholar, because I'm much more interested in how we imagine change than how we anticipate change. And in a way, anticipate change sounds a little bit old-fashioned to me, and also has a bit of this connotation of, the old forecasting, predictive kind of modes of looking at the future. And imagination really opens that up, right? And that's also, I think we can all agree in this room that we need radical alternatives to the unjust and unsustainable present we're currently faced with. And I think imagination is a much more powerful term to capture that, I guess. Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective to call the imagination angle more powerful, because at least in my experience, there's also resistance among practitioners in particular to the idea of imagination as potentially being a profession or an activity that is part of governing in the serious domains that we're moving in.
Yeah,
where,
definitely.
We are maybe perceived to be less serious or less scientific or less systematic, less helpful if we're talking about imagination and diverse futures rather than the ability to anticipate, predict, and therefore support policy. So I think one of the challenges of this field, and especially the imagination scholarship, might be really to be able to argue or create a justification for why and how it matters. There is a difference. I believe you're right. There is a difference between those terms, and the imagination itself and imagination activities are definitely important. But it still faces, I think, resistance or hesitance, or maybe a little bit of looking down at the idea of imagination, at least in my experience. So, but that's just a personal reflection. Yeah. All right, folks. I think we had a really interesting conversation, a bit of a survey of the things that have been going on in our field. We don't have to force another 10 minutes of conversation if you all feel that you got to say what you had to say. I do want to encourage you all again, though, to still use that form that we offered to make your submissions, to enter your let's say, nominations of really important contributions that you maybe are working with yourself, that have been helpful in your own intellectual development and work. You know, Lucas, if you say you've just moved towards imagination the last couple of years, what made you move? Like, was there something that, you know, you were reading that got you here? So that would be really interesting, I think, to understand for us, like what were the key conceptual bits or methodological changes that have
Can
been
you
driving that.
share that link once more, Blake?
Yeah, I threw that in. Maybe Blake, can you recopy that
Yeah, I
form
think
to the
it's
Google
at the
form?
top of the chat somewhere, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. So, and with that, maybe I'll give it back to Joost for a closing word and say thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Manjana. Thanks, everyone. This was really great. Wonderful that that everyone made time to turn up. Sometimes at hours that are not ideal. Sometimes it's okay. But yeah, really appreciate this. We have another session tomorrow, which is an open conversation about imagination and anticipation in an era of polycrisis, in which we want to talk more about this sort of like the strategic directions of this work. What are key challenges for future research around, and we've gathered, Manjana and I have gathered some of this input from the larger anticipation and imagination community around inclusive anticipation and imagination, the power of future making, practices and institutions of imagination, how to drive policy change. So we want to talk about that tomorrow. Hope some of you can join us, or all of you if you want to, in the morning CET anyway. So that would be at 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. CEST. And at the end of that conversation, we'll also have a little bit of a chat about how do we organize around that within Earth System governance. And I think it would be nice to also talk about next year in South Africa, if people are interested in coming to that big multi-conference. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of the day, if there's more of the day left on your side, and we hopefully see you tomorrow. And thanks again, everyone, for a wonderful conversation. Thanks so much, Manjana, for leading it and for organizing so much of this session. It's really wonderful.
Thanks, everyone. Hopefully see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.